Well, I'm really excited to start with this panel. I will introduce Laiqah Osman, our chair. Laiqah Osman is a historian and researcher at the Islam Center in the Department of Religion and Theology at Cardiff University. Her work, displaying great gender sensibility, engages with Islamic authority in the online space and wider practice of religion in the offline space. Well, Laiqah, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Manuela. Yeah, I'd just like to say thank you so much for that lovely introduction. I'm really excited for today's panel. So like Manuela said, today's panel is on media and religion. And a big thank you to the Institute of Modern Languages Research, School of Advanced Study. So if I begin by introducing our first speaker. So Carolina Falcão is from the Federal University of Pernambuco, Brazil, and her paper is titled Neither Conservative Nor Broadcasting, Non-Hegemonic Christianity and the Religious Protagonism in Brazil. Carolina is a journalist and PhD in social communication, graduated from Federal University of Pernambuco, institution where she currently works as a postdoctoral researcher at the graduate program in human rights. As a postdoc researcher, she is now working on the topics of religious activism, human rights, and democracy, with a focus on the idea of secular imagination and theological transitions in the current Brazilian scenario. Very impressive, and I'm really excited to hear your paper today, Carolina. So if you want to share your screen.
So thank you, Laiqah, for this introduction. Before I move to the presentation itself, I would like to thank Manuela for all the work she did before this conference, all her emails and everything she did to make everybody now comfortable and ready to this presentation. So thank you very much, Manuela. So I'm here to present a piece of my PhD dissertation. I finished it in the end of 2019, a long time ago, and it's somehow challenging to visiting again this piece of my work and to make this presentation. So I decided to start it I think it's important to clarify the title. I think that many of you may be asking, what is she meaning when she says broadcasting? So what, after all, am I talking when I say broadcasting? And of course, when I say religious. It is important to say the term broadcasting, especially in media studies, is often used as an adjective one can use to qualify something, a media product, for example. In that sense, broadcasting refers to media capital, combining a range of possibilities like TV shows, radio stations, blockbuster movies, or codes that resemble an auditorium show reaching massive audiences. When I say broadcasting, I mean the kind of infrastructure that enhances material and symbolic reproduction of the kind of religious leadership that drives the growth and strength of a range of Christian denominations among Catholics and Protestants in Brazil. Broadcasting, hegemonic, the mainstream, all these terms share some common ground when we think of names like Silas Malafaia, Edir Macedo, R.R. Soares, very popular pastors, tele-evangelists, for example. Such figures rely on massive media structures and help it to shape the common sense that the evangelicals are basically conservative people who has a lot to say. So it leads me to the second name, to the second term in my title, when I say religious. In this particular work, religious resonates the complexities that inform Christianity in Brazil in a specific and delimited sense, the one of antagonism. So an antagonism, let's say, that is raised within Christianity and not against it. So when I'm talking about religious protagonism, I'm paying full attention to these Christian denominations and how antagonism is built within them and not any other denomination against them. So making this, with that said, I think that I should present the first question of my work, which is how do non-hegemonic Christians, whether they are institutions or public persons or NGOs or even churches, how do these non-hegemonic Christians constitute, legitimize, and cast themselves out of the broadcasting? So yes, I not only agree that there is a place out of broadcasting, but I am also assuming that this position is the place of antagonism and more. It composes, the idea of antagonism composes the very conception of the hegemonic, like Laiqah and Mouffe state in the discourse theory. And to this place of antagonism, to this place out of broadcasting or out of this common sense regarding religious leaderships, I put a name, which is the religious protagonism. So to grasp religious protagonism, it is necessary to pay attention to the discursive praxis this antagonistic place conveys. Therefore, the materiality of analysis couldn't relate to broadcasting patterns, but on the other way around, it should consider the flow of internet texts and the possibilities such non-broadcasting, non-hegemonic voices achieve once they are online. What do they say? What are the negotiations they make to present themselves as religious, whether Catholics or Protestants, but politically different from the common sense that normally is associated to such figures? The more engaged in the weblogs, Instagram profiles, podcasts, YouTube channels, transmedia projects, the more I learned about their discursive praxis of differentiation, antagonism, and articulation. The more I understood about the theological and political struggles to reclaim certain meanings. I brought here as a sample of this idea of religious protagonism, 2 cases. I used many others in my dissertation, but I brought here only 2. And these 2 help me to make this big picture of the religious protagonism I'm talking about. The first one is the Baptist pastor Henrique Vieira. He's almost a pop star in certain progressive circles. And the other one is the NGO Catholics for Choice in Brazil. So my idea here is trying to dive into this idea of religious protagonism set in the sense of an antagonism to an hegemonic force that is somehow informing the notions of what is an evangelical or what is a Christian person in Brazil. So religious protagonism tackles 2 main questions, basically, that are what to do with such antagonism, and how to be or how to perform such antagonism. Of course, we are talking about online texts and online products. So basically, what do they do, and how do they perform such position of antagonism? The first question, what to do, concerns a political matter. Religious protagonism designs disputes, struggles for the control of meanings, observes certain signifiers, and then reclaim to them other meanings, non-hegemonic meanings. Here, I bring the example of Pastor Vieira, who is well known for his statements on what is a real evangelical or a real Christian, for example. When Henrique Vieira says, not all evangelicals, not all Christians, he's not only pointing to that place of antagonism, but also making room to another political grammar fully identified to a progressive agenda. So this first one here, nem todo evangélico é conservador, not all evangelicals are conservative, it was released in 2019. We are living the first semester of Bolsonaro government. And of course, the fully identification of a conservative agenda with evangelicals was really strong and emphasized by many religious leaders. So that kind of voice or that kind of statement putting an antagonism to a common sense idea started to become really popular among some circles of progressive religious groups. So not all evangelicals, not all Christians became a kind of, how can I say, a model, you know, to establish this difference. Another content that he published that became really popular, it was "Não quero país evangélico," I don't want an evangelical country. And he was explaining what kind of evangelical country he didn't want. So this kind of differentiation speaks volumes about, you know, the politics of religious protagonism. So therefore, the politics of religious protagonism establishes the difference. This is what Laiqah frames as the impossibility of conclusion of any hegemonic arrangement. So it's important to note how as any figure of religious protagonism moves to make this kind of differentiation from what is a real Christian, what is a real evangelical, the more he or she needs to establish this difference, saying, look, they are like this and we are that. So this differentiation never lose mind from the hegemonic forms. So it's something that in the discourse theory, Laiqah insists to say that hegemonic forms can never get fully concluded. So that point when it doesn't conclude, then you find antagonism. So the political place of antagonism is exactly to establish this difference. The second question is differently conveys the ethical work of remaining religious when one also navigates other subjectivities. I brought here the example of the Catholic for Choice in Brazil, but it's worth noting how many anonymous young Christian women create online and produce real pedagogical works, literally teaching how to manage such distinct subjectivities as Christian and feminist, for example, or being Catholic and also supporting abortion. The discourse theory helps us to address these questions of articulation when it says that once you establish the difference, we are not like them, but it's possible to be in these so many other ways. This articulatory work is very, it's common to be observed among these figures, especially among communities of women, religious women, and this pedagogical work in saying, look, it's possible to be this and that. It's possible to be this, that, and that. And I brought the example of the Catholics for Choice because they are famous. They have, they are part of many public controversials in the public debate, but it's interesting to note also how many young women, they are investing a lot, not only in terms of finding themselves as feminists, but finding also themselves as religious. So this idea of remaining religious or articulating many subjectivities. The ethics of religious protagonism teaches how to be by articulating to one religion's affiliation or identity, many other affiliations or identities. And finally, this long and sometimes apparently endless aftermath of Bolsonaro's election that we are now living has proven that novel sensibilities to the religious public presence are not only arising, but also they are disclosing different patterns to opposition and contestation. I like to think that the more terrible some Christians become, and they got nominated to be ministers, like our human rights minister, Damaris Alves, who said she said something like, quote, Brazil is a secular country, but this minister here herself is terribly Christian. And like the André Mendonça, who was nominated to be minister at the Supreme Court, and who was presented by Bolsonaro as a terribly Christian, terrible evangelical minister. So I like to think that the more terrible some Christians become and more powerful, many others reclaim themselves to be non-broadcasting and non-conservative. In this sense, the politics and ethics of protagonism speak volumes about strategies of visibility and relevance, and offer a different grammar for progressive religious activism, but not only to religious activism, any kind of progressive activism against the current state of affairs in the country. So I brought here these 3 pieces. These 3 pictures, they were not taken in religious events properly, you know? There were events against Bolsonaro in certain moments since 2018. So, se Bolsonaro estiver certo, Jesus Cristo estava errado. If Bolsonaro is right, Jesus Christ is wrong. Jesus is love, not him. A church that doesn't protest is not Protestant. So I'm pretty much convinced that that kind of discourse that comes specifically from this idea of antagonism, that using religious grammar is helping to shape an aspect of the protest against Bolsonaro and against what Bolsonaro represents in terms of this articulation of the conservative religious wave that we are living now. So it is pretty much what I brought you to talk about religious protagonism. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Carolina. Just before the time ends, so you stuck to your original timing, which is fantastic. So hopefully we've had a question already in the chat, which we'll get to, but we'll move on to the next speaker for now. So next we have Lorena Moschel from the National Museum of Brazil, and her paper is entitled A Ministry on WhatsApp, Digital Media and the Changing Pentecostal Women Lives in Rio de Janeiro Peripheral Zones. Lorena is a PhD candidate for social anthropology at the postgraduate program of social anthropology at the National Museum of Brazil, Federal University of Rio de Janeiro. She is currently working on her thesis, which has the provisional title, A Ministry on WhatsApp, Pentecostal Women Through Churches and Social Media. Lorena is also a member of the research team NUSEX, which is Gender and Sexuality Studies Center, cited at the same program, and has experience in ethnographic research, teaching as an assistant professor in social psychology from August 2018 to February 2021. Some of her published articles focused on the anthropology of religion, gender and sexuality studies, eroticism and material culture, Pentecostal studies in Latin American urban peripheries. So the floor is yours, Lorena.
Good morning, good afternoon, everyone. I would like to thank to the organizers, the chair, and the participants for dialogue and contribute to our works. I am a PhD student in social anthropology at the National Museum in Rio de Janeiro. And today I will present a piece of my in-progress thesis, which I discuss about how gender, sexuality, race, class, and age as an intersectional perspective reflects and are reflected on religious changes at peripheral zones in Rio de Janeiro. My main object in this presentation reflects on how WhatsApp, the most digital platform in Brazil, became a central part of my analysis on the daily religious lives of my interlocutors. In the beginning of my research, studying the coupling of digital relations and religion was not in my horizons. The intention was to follow my previous steps in my master's dissertation when I sought to understand how a sex shop target at Christian customers was interacting with its audience. Located in a big favela in Rio de Janeiro, where Pentecostalism was the main religious faith, this erotic boutique, using my interlocutor's words, used it to emphasize on products such as custom dresses, oils, and other lotions targeted at heterosexual couples, while not being aggressive to men. As I followed this erotic and religious stuff, aimed to avoid divorces by strengthening evangelical marriages and empower women's self-esteem, I came to a famous mega Pentecostal church located in a peripheral area of Rio de Janeiro. More specifically, I started to attend events aimed at evangelical women, commonly called women's tea, where some of these erotic products were held during the cult, away from the presence of men. That's how I met a particular group of women interested in talking about their struggles with children and marriage, including domestic violence, children with drug issues, and their own sexual issues. It was in this context that I was invited to join their WhatsApp group that reunited the female followers of the Gracious Women's Tea, named after their in-person event. The group is led by a couple of Black pastors aged around 40s, working as volunteer pastors in this famous Pentecostal church in Brazil. This event frequently occurred in the church, but also inside these women's houses. The participants come from different churches, most of them followers of Universal Kingdom Church, Igreja Universal do Reino de Deus, and Assembly of God's Ministries, or don't even go to church. In this case, evangelical members call them visitors. So when I joined this group digitally, I could observe that the WhatsApp group was not only used for inviting new women to new events, but also to engage them in a daily routine. The female pastor used it to share long audio preaches in this group, and as soon as the women received them, she immediately responded with their own prayers and prayer requests to family members, especially their husbands and kids. Even though the group was guided by a couple, the female pastor used it to lead the most part of the interactions in the group, encouraged by, and the members were encouraged by her to send their prayers through voice messages. And I'm thinking about this, how these women created a method of communication among themselves in which listening to each other's voices became an important way to pray together, keeping everyone in the group connected by the same faith, race, and gender. For example, a woman who asks for prayers for her sick mother at the hospital, emphasizing they should come as voice messages because then her mother would be able to listen and pray with them. On the other hand, the pastor, this female pastor, uses the group to send special blessings through voiced prayers, sharing the participants' messages with other groups. And then she would like to create the feeling of a praying crowd. There are about 10 Gracious Women's groups with an average of 50 women per group, and many of the participants joined after attending the Gracious Women's Tea. Others were invited by friends. The female followers don't necessarily meet each other in person. It's important to say that I'm a member of two of these WhatsApp groups. There's a group from Rio and another group from Italy, in which all the other members are Brazilian immigrants living in Europe, most of them working in low-paid positions. And I am a kind of an activate member, participant inside the group, and they also know I'm a researcher. This includes some of the women from Italy, which I had the opportunity to interview by video call after the female pastor returned from the mission trip to Europe. She went to a mission trip in Europe, which was paid by these women. However, studying WhatsApp was not an outcome from a path sought by me in order to study online relations on religions, but rather a consequence of how relationships were established within this ministry, considering religion as media, or I quote, religion that is media, as stated by Jeremy Stollo. The Zap group, a common way to call WhatsApp groups in Brazil, reached 98% of Brazilians with the app installed on their cell phones in 2019. According to the Global Digital Report, this is the numbers that they show. In addition to the new right and far right groups increasing all over the world, which Brazilian anthropologist Letícia Cesarino has named digital populism, evangelical WhatsApp groups were known as one of the most beneficial settings for spreading fake news since the last presidential election, having helped to elect Bolsonaro. Mediated relations are creating new ways of being pastors and believers, and being inside their online routines has allowed me to see power dynamics in which leaderships and followers occupied active and dynamic positions. In their terms, they are living in this group as a ministry. Differently from several evangelical groups, they don't see themselves as a cell church, but as a praying group. I quote, a ministry without a church seat, in the words of the female pastor who leads the group of women. According to her, most prayer groups have a religious message, a biblical verse, but they don't have leaders preaching every night with the group. I am trying to analyze how this structured routine is showing a relocation of the most commonly held understanding of ministry as a physical space, like a church, to explore this further into what Brazilian anthropologist Carli Machado analyzes about Pentecostal ministry in peripheral zones of Rio de Janeiro. In her words, these Pentecostal ministries are dynamic institutions, changeable, unstable, and put into place a broad media and communication action. In this way, I have been analyzing WhatsApp use as a privileged field to live spiritual battles. These battles are sensory, experienced through sensory forms, as Birgit Meyer calls them, the anthropology professor Birgit Meyer, and they also imply power relations, which I have been exploring here through how the notion of church is in dispute between subjects and religious institutions. The main questions drawing my attention here are about how non-institutional forms of religious life are organizing mediated strategies of communication and changing relations between evangelical women. I'm trying to emphasize their online routines as a constant exercise in which I am led to imagine not only who was praying at the moment, but also to visualize places and people who those prayers are intended for. For example, while a participant sends a photo of a container with olive oil or grape juice, asking for divine intervention, she anoints the clothes and photos of her son, who at the moment would be receiving that prayer in a boca de fumo, the term used to refer to drug dealing spots, which in Rio are most located in favelas. Meanwhile, another participant makes a request for prayers for her sister-in-law who is sick at the hospital. During the prayer, she brings details about her relative names, the place where she is, and a long description of each touch or on each organ of that hospitalized patient. The detailed descriptions of the divine hand touch each of the patient's organ just as oil announced each part of the drug used in someone's body. I'm about to conclude now. Through soundscapes formed by different tones of female voices, most of them very grave and firm, it is possible to imagine their houses, the bocas de fumo, cemeteries, and crossroads, where objects resulting from witchcraft or macumba, witchcraft is how evangelical groups, some of evangelical groups, Pentecostal groups, actually call objects used in ritual of African Brazilian religions. There's spaces inhabited by evils that must be destroyed to bring healing and protection for children, husbands, family members, or for the women themselves. Since the beginning of the new coronavirus pandemic, the pastor's enthusiasm to preach has increased. As she said, the virus only make them go further. Other strategies were improved at this period, and a couple of pastors could join Facebook live stream events, which Brazilians usually call lives, always transmitted at 3 a.m. in the morning to a great number of participants. This aspect dialogues with their age, as in Brazil, we observe Facebook as social media platform whose numbers are decreasing among teenagers and young adults groups. So here, in conclusion, I have been seeking to understand how the transformation of Pentecostal rituals, such as preaching and telling testimonies, is taking place during the pandemic. The digital realm presents itself as a fundamental area to provide training in ethical sensibilities in the terms discussed by Charles Hirschkind. This bodily experience, vocal and auditive, produces a religious engagement through WhatsApp. While these women become virtuals, the leaders become pastors. The act of sharing testimonies, in turn, brings elements to think about how the sharing of these narratives in social media as a part of different female experiences in contemporary lives, as happened with hashtags like #MeToo, #BelieveSurvivors, and the alike. Feminist experience on social media have shown that the power of sharing these narratives lies on connecting emotions through the collective circulations of these voices, displacing positions of authority and legitimacy. Although evangelical women define themselves as anti-feminists, these evangelical women define themselves as anti-feminists. These alliances on WhatsApp dispute the meanings of the term empowerment and denounce violence and sexual harassment inside and outside their marriages. If for these women, church is their cell phone, the sharing of testimonies can be a key analytical category to understand how evangelical women who fight feminisms are transforming religion and digital media. So thank you for your attention. I would be pleased to answer more questions if you have.
Thank you so much, Lorena. That was a fascinating presentation. It's really interesting how in both yours and Carolina's presentation, politics is kind of an element of an overarching theme. So I'm excited to see what questions we have at the end. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce our final speaker, Giovanna Miralles. She's from Canterbury, Christchurch University in the UK, and her paper is entitled Digitising the Sacred, Maya Women's Cosmovision Online. So Giovanna is graduated from the International Cinema and Television School in Cuba with a scholarship from the Fundación del Nuevo Cine Latinoamericano. She has worked in different areas of art and film production in Latin America and Europe, specializing in documentaries. In Guatemala, she studied the oral tradition and rituals of the Maya to become a spiritual leader. Since moving to the UK, she studied sociology at the Open University and more recently worked in 2 documentaries Uma Turca, The Call of the Water in 2016 as director, and Legacies of 1936 as scriptwriting editor and in 2018. Giovanna's research is focused in the areas of documentary, post-memory, feminism, identity, decolonization, and cultural resistance. So the floor is over to you, Giovanna. I will.
Thank you.
Now.
I will share my screen. One. All right. Thank you. I am very happy to participate in this panel. Thank you to the organizers and to the other participants, which work I find very interesting. Thank you. I lived in Guatemala during the 90s in a period referred to as the peace process. I was fresh from film school and interested to document the indigenous communities of Latin America. Through my experience of working with film producers and directors of indigenous films in Bolivia, I felt that I was ready to understand Maya culture from the inside. Little did I know I was going to become an Ajquijap, or a spiritual leader, and the process of learning will continue until today. Both countries, Guatemala and Bolivia, have the highest rate of indigenous population in Latin America. Although they share social similarities, historical factors draw them apart, such as the 1953 agrarian reforms. The Bolivian was the most drastic in Latin America and generated highly contradictory processes, while the Guatemalan agrarian reform, successful at the beginning, became dramatic and chaining the events that led to the overthrow of President Arbenz in 1954, the overturning of lands to private hands, and the subsequent Guatemalan Civil War, which lasted from 1960 to 1996. Terms. In Latin America, the term indigenous, although widely accepted because its relation with the fight for indigenous rights, has not stopped from being contentious. A majority of the indigenous people in Guatemala prefer to be recognized under the term Maya, which include different ethnic groups which share the same cultural root. Why digitization? In general, we are used to the term digitization in relation to archives and libraries, which are digitized to preserve and to make them available to the public online. In this case, I am applying this term to the digitization of an oral transmitted knowledge, which until the end of the 20th century was zealously kept by specialists. The Maya calendar Cholquic. The 260 days Maya calendar Cholquic is one of the two principal calendars still in use, along with the Hap by the Maya people. The Maya spirituality is practiced through the Maya ceremonies and the use of the Cholquic. The Ajquijap, or bearer of time, is a person who counts the days and knows their meaning. Previously, it was translated as Maya priest or priestess. Today are known as spiritual guides. The Maya spirituality is rooted in the oral tradition practiced and maintained by specialists. During the armed conflict and because of the indigenous genocide, there was a fear between the Ajquijaps for the continuity of the tradition. The Maya spirituality was officially recognized as a symbol of identity and political rights during the peace agreements in 1997. Bastos and Cummins document that in the dynamic context of the 80s and 90s appeared a new religious proposal which openly recognized itself as Maya, and it is different from the others because it does not present itself as a religion, but as a spirituality. Furthermore, it is based on the Mayan cosmovision and does not have a Christian foundation. Nowadays, there is a standard way to officiate a Maya ceremony, based in the Quiché tradition, although other traditional forms are practiced by the diverse ethnic groups. On post-memory. Hedge recognizes the inherent character of post-memory as the experience of those who grow up dominated by narratives that precede their birth, shaped by traumatic events that can be neither fully understood nor recreated. In the long thread of history, the indigenous population of Latin America has resisted colonial imposition through the use of different strategies of adaptation. In the 16th century, anonymous Maya Quichés wrote the Popol Vuh in their own language, using the Latin alphabet to transcribe the oral narrative that recounts the creation of the world and the origin of the human race. However, as Silvia Rivera Cusicanqui points out, in colonialism, there is a very particular function for words. They do not name, they mask. For this reason, decolonization cannot solely be a thought or rhetoric, because words can distance themselves from the practice, and the Cholquic calendar is primarily learned through experience. Cultural resistance. Indigenous cultural resistance and adaptation strategies since colonial times have been widely documented in Guatemala. Sicumes, Chirics, Sulsul, Warren, McClintock. The indigenous population of Latin America has been able to protect their culture, languages, and knowledge by maintaining their beliefs, applying diverse strategies. In the case of the Maya, the oral tradition, mnemonic systems, and the continuous use of the Cholquic by specialists has been vital to maintain the Maya spirituality alive. They resorted to what they called the invisible, a system where traditional practices, oral history, and rituals exist as a form of cultural resistance. Maintaining knowledge, cosmovision, and identity. In the pictures, we can see the cites seats, which are used along the Cholquic as a piece of advice and an oracular method. They are used by the Akihabs and authorities to define important dates and matters which concern the community or individuals. We can also see a Maya ceremony being performed with participation of members of the national movement of midwives Nimalashik, and a map with the state-recognized Mayan altars as sacred sites. Previously, many of these altars were kept secret. Many of them are situated in remote, hidden places or of difficult access as a way of secrecy. The map that we see was elaborated to protect these places from being vandalized by radical Christian groups, illegal developments, or being destroyed for the exploitation of natural resources. The sacred calendar Cholquic. The uninterrupted use of the sacred Maya calendar Cholquic by the Mayas is a continuous act of resistance. This lunar calendar marks the time for agricultural and ceremonial dates. Overall, it is an important working tool for the work of the Maya midwives. It has 260 days, and as the Akikab say, it is written in the human body, which has 13 joints, the number of the energies, and 20 fingers and toes as the number of the Nawals, who are the bearers which carry each day. The Nawals are Bats, the time, the path, the sacred vara, Ish, the woman, and so on. Each Nawal has multiple meanings which change in accordance with the number that precedes them. The Cholquic as a tool for specialists. Here we can see a calendar posted on the Facebook page of the National Movement of Midwives Nimalashik, in which appears the Cholquic in relation to the Gregorian calendar. As I mentioned before, the Cholquic is a lunar calendar, and for the same reason of vital importance for the midwives' work, who are able to follow women's cycles and determine birth dates through its use. Mayanization and the Cholquic. From a specialist calendar to a symbol of identity. The Akihab are the guardians of the Maya tradition and the calendar's knowledge. By moving online, the Cholquic went from being a specialist calendar interpreted by an Akihab inside the community in a defined time and context to being standardized and available to everybody. When I lived in Guatemala in the 90s, the Cholquic knowledge was not widely available. It was necessary to become an apprentice in order to access it. In the picture, we can see a mimeograph copy of the research made by the Ahquijab Gerardo Barrios, who made a compilation of the meaning of the 20 nawals of the Cholquic after interviewing around 100 specialists. This research covered important aspects of the Maya philosophy and belief system and became the template for the Cholquic digitized by the Ministry of Sports and Culture of Guatemala in 2013. The three images, two of them digitized, correspond to the Nahual Noh, the Nahual of Wisdom, which also appears in the logo of the movement of midwives Nimalashik. The third image is an interpretation of the day Noh in the midwives Facebook page. It is possible to observe how the meaning of the day has been shortened for a major visual impact with a picture of the animal which represents the day. This information has also been shared as a podcast. In an interview with the graphic designer, he mentioned that the meanings for the post were provided by local specialists. This information is posted by Nimalashik daily as an authentic source of knowledge and to show their Maya identity. Today, the Maya calendar is ubiquitous online in logos, names of institutions, and social media pages, where it is possible to find an explanation of each day's meaning. How the Cholquic's philosophy represented in Maya women's narratives How is the Cholquic's philosophy represented in Maya women's narratives in relation to their knowledge, worldviews, and philosophies online? A midwife is born, not made. A Maya midwife does not receive a salary, they receive a donation by the parturient for their family or their family for their work. This can range from a monetary contribution to animals or provisions. Many of them come from a lineage of midwives. Others have born in a day propitious in the Cholquic calendar to take this path. The Maya midwives provide their service out of cost to not only rural areas, but also the urban periphery. Their defiant motto, a midwife is born, is not made. Una comadrona nace, no se hace, tell us about their commitment and their cosmovision based in the use of the Cholquic, the lunar Maya calendar. Their body of knowledge involves specialist techniques and therapies. The adverse conditions of their work have not improved in all these years. They continue traveling by their own means to remote sites to attend their patients. They are discriminated at hospitals. Western practitioners have appropriated their knowledge, and until recently, they were not recognized by the Guatemalan healthcare system. In a Zoom meeting at the beginning of the COVID-19 pandemic, a midwife commented that the terrible working conditions were only comparable with what she experienced during the armed conflict. Midwives denounced that they walked for miles to attend their patients, sometimes to be stopped by patrols controlling the curfew. They still not count with proper PPE or sanitary facilities. Even with hospitals collapsed because of the pandemic, the Maya midwives have continued working on first line, proving to be fundamental to attend the health needs of the population. On the 26th of January 2021, Day Hulahuktihash, they successfully were recognized by the government with the implementation of a plan of action to the national policy for the midwives of the 4 people of Guatemala, becoming part of the Guatemalan health system, but still without a salary. We can observe an Ahquijab performing a blessing for the success of the encounter of women in power organized by the Association of Maya Lawyers Chomija. During this encounter, women who are traditional authorities in the system of municipalities recount how they have used la vara as an element to assert their power, especially in situations where they were called to resolve problems of domestic violence, sharing their experiences as authorities and supporting each other. Conclusions. The process of conveying the chalky abstract concepts in a contested media such as an online virtual place certainly implies a process of cultural surrender, yet paradoxically vital and empowering to Maya culture. The often romanticized vision of Maya women, their culture needs, and way of life requires a paradigm change. For this, it is necessary to look beyond economic discrimination in relation to their knowledge, worldviews, and philosophies. Currently, feminist Maya women, such as Emma Chirix, Aura Cumes, Gladys Sulsul, and others, are contesting the narrative imposed by the state, along with associations such as the National Movement of Midwives, Nima Lashik, to overcome social prejudices and media-imposed perceptions, reclaiming their place in society. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Giovanna. That was a fascinating presentation. I've taken lots and lots of notes.
Professor Valentina Napolitano. She is professor of social cultural anthropology at the Department of Anthropology at the University of Toronto. She authored several books, edited collections, and journal articles on themes related to religion, migration, and gender. Her current work on theopolitics promotes a timely interdisciplinary dialogue between anthropology, politics, and theology. Well, Professor Valentina, it's very good. It's a pleasure having you here with us, and the floor is yours.
Thank you. And I really wanted to sort of thank you wholeheartedly to the collective discussion. I'm really sorry, we're at the beginning of the term, so I'm just coming here. I wish I could have, participate to the other panels. It's just, we have different temporalities, but I'm very glad to be here with everybody. And I just wanted to do talking about kind of religion, sanctity, and soil. I would like to do just a small land acknowledgement. I'm talking from Toronto. So I wish to acknowledge this land on which the University of Toronto operates, a land often inhabited by the Huron-Wendat, the Seneca, and the Mississauga Credit, among many others group. And I'm very grateful and humble to have the opportunity to work through this land. So I thought that, talking about religion, theology of the Americas, we need to be co-participant of the soil that nourishes us. So I just wanted to be just here very kind of doing my work of coordination and kind of keeping time of this very interesting panel, which is entitled Religion and Decolonial Perspective. So what am I going to do? I'm just remind the speaker that they have 15 minutes to present, and then we could leave 5-7 minutes for Q&A. Is this how you have done it? And then we introduce, the other speaker. And then hopefully there's going to be a little time at the end to have a collective discussion. But this is already a collective engendering or bringing forward ideas. So which is very, very important, very good. So I start with the doctoral candidate, Patrick Brock from the University of Oslo. And he's a research fellow, doctoral research fellow at the Department of, he's a doctoral research fellow, not a doctoral candidate, at the Department of Cultural Studies and Oriental Languages at the University of Oslo. He's part of the ERC-funded Core Future Research Project into science fiction and futurism from non-English speaking countries, and focuses on work from Latin America and the Caribbean. And the title of his talk is Epistemological Spirituality in Brazilian Afrofuturism. So I leave the floor to you, Patrick.
Let me start by thanking the organizers for allowing me to present my research today. It offered a great opportunity to approach one corner of my research into futurist movements. And my plan is to present an interpretation that leans heavily on studies of science and speculative fiction, which is my main focus. Here is my main argument. The Brazilian Afrofuturist movement emerges from a long-standing tradition of Black resistance to domination, to the dominant myth of racial harmony that denied recognition by making up the collective imaginary's compact of national identity. Once this tradition met the diasporic culture Afrofuturism in its network consciousness, it intersected with recent declines in the marginal cost of computing and communication, allowing writers and readers of science fiction to take a more active role in shaping the genre. Their politically oriented artistic practice then used speculative fiction's relationship with science and epistemology to recenter Afro-Brazilian spirituality as coeval to the Eurocentric techno-scientific knowledge system. Here we see a picture of Elza Soares, the singer, who has adopted the Afrofuturism aesthetic in her work more recently. First of all, I think we should note the importance of the Afrofuturist movement in Brazil right now. Afrofuturism surged in Brazil in the last decade, partly thanks to educational policies that increased university enrollment of Black students and the steep declines in the marginal cost of communication and computing. It expanded on an already vigorous and decade-long base of activism through art and education. Geração Tombamento in the early 2010s is the immediate precursor in parallel. It is helping Afro-Brazilians improve their self-esteem and becoming a method to instrumentalize temporal and utopian thinking. Of these three aspects, I think instrumentalizing temporal and utopian thinking is the most critical to an understanding of synchronicity as a way of gaining collective agency, synchronizing temporality. I take the approach of Helge Horlein from the University of Oslo in opposition to Hartmut Rosas, in the sense that synchronization can work both ways. It is indeed used by corporations and governments, for instance, while in the case of Afrofuturism, it mobilizes bodies and minds. What do I mean when I say epistemological spirituality? I mean that elements of Afro-Brazilian religion and culture are used as a knowledge system that challenges Eurocentrism, seeking cognitive justice. Ancestral and sacred beliefs from Africa are imagined as coeval with technology. The fusion of fantasy and science fiction blurs genre boundaries and the demarcation problem, which is how to distinguish between science and non-science. And this process proves speculative fiction's relationship with science and the mediation of knowledge. The first of our three case studies is the most vigorous one. Fábio Cabral, born in 1980, is among the best known Brazilian Afrofuturist writers, having published 4 novels. He created the term macumba punk after the informal way that people talk about candomblé and other Afro-Brazilian religions to describe his blend of fantasy and science fiction with a manifesto and detailed manifesto and everything. He uses the mythology of African and indigenous religions in world building with the express purpose of replacing European imaginaries and expanding representation. This is a book trailer for the second novel of this universe, which takes place in the city of Queto 3. Cabral only makes vague allusions to its location and to Earth, leaving implicit that Queto 3 could be another planet to where Black people escaped or perhaps colonized. We should notice the title, The Warrior Scientist of the Fierce Machete. It tells the story of a young girl with a strong talent for science and technology, which she inherited from her Orisha protector. In a world where spiritual energy fuels technology and matriarchal CEOs had a combination of rival corporations and spiritual communities.
Queto 3, lar do povo melaninado, filhos dos orixás. Uma metrópole de arranha-céus, florestas, terreiros corporativos e carros voadores. Governada por sacerdotisas empresárias com poderes paranormais e tecnologias movidas por fantasmas. Lar de Jamila Olabamide, 15 anos. Jamila é filha de Ogum e herdou de seu pai espiritual um talento incrível para criar tecnologia. E tudo parecia bem com sua família e seu relacionamento. Até que Jamila despertou um superpoder capaz de pôr a cidade inteira em risco. E isso atraiu muitos inimigos, inclusive Pedro Laluô, o valentão da escola. Mas ela não está sozinha. João Arolê e Nina Onixé estão juntos nesta batalha contra caçadores e criaturas perigosas. Será que Jamila conseguirá se reconectar com sua ancestralidade e controlar os seus poderes? Do mesmo autor de O Caçador Cibernético da Rua 13, a cientista guerreira do facão furioso. Conheça mais uma história do universo afrofuturista de Fábio Cabral, já nas livrarias. Keto 3.
So these are the three novels of this universe that he created as to show that how he's using the Afro-Brazilian spirituality in his world-building efforts. And from the book trailer, you immediately can sense that there's that video games and comic books are a huge inspiration. So the visual and narrative vocabularies that these creators are using. The second case study is Lu Einzeiler, which is the pen name of Luciene Ernesto, an educator from the Baixada Fluminense region of Rio de Janeiro. She's a speculative fiction writer and Afrofuturist researcher who has published 3 novels and 1 book of short stories. Initially, she was more focused on what we call hard sci-fi, which would be more on the science side of it. It's it values a lot the plausibility of the concepts. And more recently, she has written fantasy stories. The story Dame Dame shows a fusion of African cultural elements and technology into what she calls magi science. Published last year, it tells the story of 3 friends from different parts of Brazil, some of them residing in low-income neighborhoods in the peripheries of Brazil's large cities, using teletransportation app to visit fairgrounds happening at the Nabta Playa archaeological site in Egypt. They are apprentice magicians, and the story has a Harry Potter feel, but replaces the European Gothic elements with African-inspired ones, like the adinkras, which are ideograms developed in Western Africa, and which carry philosophical meaning, and ancient African science, exemplified by the Nabta Playa archaeological site, which is considered one of the first astronomical sites in the world. So this connection with ancient knowledge is something we'll see later on with the mythologian concept. And our third case study is a short film produced and released in Salvador, Bahia, by a younger generation of creators, which provides an amazing example of the increasingly sophisticated artistry involved in Brazilian Afrofuturism. It works almost like an art installation, combining imagery, special effects, and monologue into a sort of Bilderbergsroman centered on the figure of Abian, or the apprentice in Candomblé spiritual communities. Its stated goal is to build a link among the sacred, profane, and ancestrality through a decolonial epic. It was created by Mayara Ferrão, Diego Alcântara, and Felipe Mimoso with a 360-degree video technology. Candomblé is present in the name and the body language, the gestural way, the way of dressing, and the imagery. As argued by Leda Martins, the ritual performances associated with the sacred, for example, are fertile occasions to recreate the vast domain of reminiscence, given the multiple repertoires of mnemonics, patterns, techniques, and residual culture procedures expressed by the body and through the body, the site of memory for many cultural backgrounds. The rites transmit and institute aesthetic, philosophical, metaphysical, and other forms and modes of knowledge through their frames, their apparatuses, and conventions that shape the performance. The relationship with the sci-fi vocabulary is minimal, but still seminal. As you can see, the astronaut and space are evoked, as well as the opening of the movie Alien from 1979. The astronaut flowing through space, it's a major marker of phenomenological wonder and the techno-sublime, while the competing videos within the screen create a sense of dislocation, but also of multiplicity of viewpoints. So I just want to show a little bit of the video and how it works. So you can move around. You see some of the candomblé imagery. Okay, now why science fiction and Afrofuturism? I think it's important to delimit this. Here are some elements which explain why Afrofuturism sometimes uses sci-fi, and specifically the cases discussed here. First, we should delimit what futurism is. It's a politically oriented aesthetic movement that mobilizes collectivities through artistic discourse to enact immediate change. It is important to note that not all futurisms are ethnic and that they can be dialogical. By themselves, they can be works of creation, but what separates them from obscurity is their degree of acceptance, meaning how much they engage collectivity. Next aspect we have is the work of John Reader, who argued that science fiction, speculative fiction, is a mass cultural genre. And he raised the issue of boundary objects, which comes from studies of science. These objects are plastic enough to adapt to local needs and constraints of the several parties employing them, yet robust enough to maintain a common identity across sites. This is what I like to call the fuzzy but solid character of speculative fiction, in the sense that it provides a shared space of contestation, which is another element that engages collectivity. The blending of science fiction and fantasy elements is a contested space by itself. So the boundary work, again, another science studies term in science fiction communities, has similarities to how science and technology are negotiated and accepted through social technical imaginaries, which are collective ways of thinking. Lastly, we have the heuristic function of speculative fiction, which is educational but also aspirational as a way of thinking or a mindset. All of these elements form the powerful synchronized impulse of boundary work and boundary objects. Once we have asserted the decolonial motivation of these works and how they operate in contested space that activate collectivity, we can turn to the mythologerm. The mythologerm was developed to understand Indian speculative fiction, Cosmovision, and its tendency to rework the history of science by using the mythic, often making it a source of alternative science or as a marker of distinction between one kind of speculative fiction and another. In India, the mythologerm helps explain the tensions between superstition, native knowledge systems, and colonial science depicted in Cosmovision works, where characters try to understand the paranormal. The narratives help negotiate the colonial encounter while unveiling the real power hierarchies of science's supposed internationalism. By transposing the mythologerm from Indian speculative fiction to Brazilian Afrofuturism, helps explain why authors are fusing magical elements with the techno-scientific to decolonize by adding diversity to epistemological vocabularies, while inscribing oral traditions into a genre that mediates knowledge and science. So we're talking about science fiction's shared traits with how science and techno-scientific imagination are negotiated in society. These are my references. Thank you very much for your time.
Okay, so we pass to the next one, which is presented by Professor David Dunkley, who is an Associate Professor of Black Studies and the Director of Peace Studies at the University of Missouri in Columbia, Missouri. He is the author of Women and Resistance in the Early Rastafari Movement in 2001, and is also author and co-authored several other books and articles, including The Politics of Repatriation of the First Rastafari, 1932-1940, will just come out in Souls. And his presentation is entitled Edna Fisher and the Politics of Early Rastafari. Thank you very much, Dave.
Thank you. Thank you very much for that introduction. And thank you to the organizers for arranging such an interesting conference. I want to talk to you a little bit today about Edna Fisher and the politics of the early Rastafari movement. Fisher is depicted in the slide you see there on your screen. And I put up an image of Jamaica just to remind you. I know Jamaica needs no introduction to this audience of the place that we're talking about and where all of this drama unfolded. So I think I should start by saying that the people I interviewed about Edna E. Fisher had joined her organization in the 1950s and 1960s. That's very important. So these are people who actually interacted with her. Fisher, they told me, along with her partner and future husband, the Reverend Claudius Henry, formed their organization in 1958 in the parish of St. Andrew in British colonial Jamaica. Their organization was known as the African Reformed Church of God in Christ, and it was a Rastafari organization, even though other Rastafari groups would, at the time, would come to deny its Rastafari identity because of the suspected coup in 1960 with Fisher and Henry implicated as the leaders. Much has been written about Henry by many scholars, Ken Post, Walter Rodney, Frank Jan van Dyck from Netherlands, Barry Chavans, and Brian Meeks and Anthony Bogues, most recently, I believe. Actually, I first encountered helpful snippets about Fisher and Bogues' book published in 2003. However, like others, Bogues deemed the events the Henry fiasco or the Henry Rebellion, which highlighted the exclusion of much of Fisher's role in building Black radical thought and activism in Jamaica. And the norm was actually to exclude women from the press coverage and scholarly studies of Rastafari and many other groups in the Black freedom struggle. The exclusion not only persisted for many years after the Jamaican independence from Great Britain in 1962, but it also helped perpetuate the distortion of the history of these women, resulting in the obscurity that the historian Lucille Mathurin Mayer identified as affecting mainly poor Black women. In light of this obscurity, later historians such as Vereen Shepherd have sought to recover the agency of these women silenced by colonialism and patriarchy. Still, Shepherd herself has stated that it is an ongoing archaeological project. Fisher's story helps us explore the themes of self-representation and resistance that have been developed by scholars such as Katie Cannon and Eula Taylor, for instance, who use them to examine the operations of patriarchy, as well as Black women's resistance to patriarchy. Taylor's concept of community feminism is quite useful, I found, and Cannon's womanist theology, and they are useful and I think very critical to the study of Fisher and other women in the early Rastafari. These concepts facilitate the analysis of women's negotiations of patriarchy, their commitments to community building, to pursue Black sovereignty, and their views of the role of religion in deconstructing patriarchy to develop the Black liberation movement. The concepts help us, in essence, to see how women conceptualize and pursue their resistance while considering their contextual constraints. Their views also form part of what Monique Bedas has more recently called interior history that can bring more attention to previously ignored topics and individuals in African diaspora history. Fisher's story remained largely untold. Before I developed an interest in it, and I became more interested in her activities as I investigated why the cloud of silence around her story. I discovered that a great deal of the silence was due to colonial patriarchy. The silencing of women actually was critical to the suppression of Rastafari, as women's spirituality and religiosity indicated the movement's potential to grow and become a dominant voice in the political landscape. As you can see from the image there, women outnumbered men in other popular religious groups at the time, including the Baptists. The Baptists were known for their historical activism, in fact, against colonial injustice, such as the Sam Sharp uprising against slavery in 1831 and the Paul Bogle-led Morant Bay uprising in 1865. And Rastafari leaders in the 1930s spoke of renewing the race consciousness that helped spark the Morant Bay Rising, noting Bogle's skin for skin and color for color ideology. The fear of women in Rastafari centered on their power as spouses, as mothers, and their political activism in public alongside men. Silencing women was one way to create the impression that Rastafari was essentially male-focused and male-dominated with suppressive views about women. The idea that women joined the movement because their male partners forced or cajoled them into it had started in the 1930s as part of the colonial suppression of Rastafari. Fisher's story is one of many that I recount in the book you heard mentioned, Women and Resistance in the Early Rastafari. The book discusses women's political activity, how this varied from the domestic to the public domains, and how this activity was critical to the colonial plan to suppress the movement's growth in Jamaica. Patriarchal ideology buried much of what Fisher did by focusing on Henry, and was crucial to subduing a great deal of the activity of the early Rastafari movement. As is well known, by the way, Rastafari originated in Jamaica in 1932 and expanded to no fewer than 8 of the 14 parishes by 1934. It was influential mainly in Kingston, St. Thomas, St. Andrews, St. Mary, and Clarendon. And the colonial government made note of this growth and tried to give the impression that the growth was primarily among what they call angry young men who were touting radical ideas about racial redemption by valorizing the 1930 coronation of Haile Selassie as the first as the Emperor of Ethiopia and the second coming of Christ Jesus. But the records are there to show that hundreds of women also joined the early Rastafari organizations. And women members, I believe, likely equaled the number of men during the first 3 decades of the movement. However, in its attempt to suppress the Rastafari, there was this tremendous focus by the colonial government on men. And it began by it only began arresting women during the cannabis raids, mostly in 1954. When the colonial police raided the first independent Rastafari community known as Pinnacle. The raid, this was one of many police incursions, but in this case, the government had decided that it was time that they disbanded this community. And by 1958, 4 years after this raid, you see depicted there, they had accomplished that goal. That same year, however, that same year marked the genesis of Fisher's organization, known as the African Reformed Church, which in many ways revitalized the Rastafari movement with its strong emphasis on spreading Black nationalism and a socialist ideology, and its promise to facilitate migration to Africa for anyone wanting to repatriate to the continent physically. Fisher's church, which I will refer to as the ARC for short, became the largest Rastafari organization in Jamaica in the 1950s through the 1962 political independence of Jamaica from Great Britain. The ARC actually had its origins in an all-woman prayer group that Fisher led, comprised of some 35 Garveyite and Rastafari adherents. They would meet perhaps weekly at Fisher's house in the parish of St. Andrew to discuss the importance of Ethiopia's emperor and empress to Black people in the diaspora. A significant development I should note is that women introduced into the early Rastafari the valorization of Empress Menen Asfa, whom they regarded as equal to the emperor. As Miriam Lennox, an early Rastafari woman, stated in her recollections, women felt Empress Menen signified the gender equality that was needed to fight injustices due to class and race. Fisher and her women's group embodied the struggle against gender disparities. Fisher herself was an independent woman who owned a wholesale fish shop business in the island's capital of Kingston. And before meeting Henry, she had also built her home on the land she bought in St. Andrew at 78 Rosalie Avenue. The date I have for her purchasing that land is 1951. So what that means is that Fisher had organized her group and continued to lead it for 5 or 6 years before she met Henry in 1957. Fisher was also the one who pursued collaboration with Henry after hearing that his message aligned with the Rastafari's adoration of the Ethiopian emperor. In addition, Henry's interest in transforming Jamaica politically into a Black nationalist country aligned well with Fisher's Garveyite background and her Rastafari orientation. Together, they created what they call the Lepers government in 1959, launched by the ARC to transform Jamaica from British to Ethiopian sovereignty peacefully. Fisher's version of Black nationalism tied Jamaica to the Ethiopian empire. Jamaica would be an overseas territory under Ethiopian sovereignty or protection, but it would abide by socialist principles for its economic organization and self-government. The government, which they named the Lepers government, would distribute land to the Jamaican people to ensure that they could cultivate their food and build their own homes. They could make a living from free access to land. The Lepers government would also reorientate the education system to teach African philosophy, history, science, and economics. And the teaching of this history would emphasize the more extended pre-colonial African past and the great civilizations that the African continent created before contact with European traders. This new Jamaican education system would also highlight how European contact underdeveloped Africa, which helps to explain why Walter Rodney, the famous Marxist historian, became so interested in Fisher's organization in the late 1960s. As Rodney recorded, Fisher and Henry had created a self-sufficient community. They had organized several independent economic entities to ensure their pursuit of Black nationalism in post-colonial Jamaica. Jamaica, as you know, aligned itself to Western capitalism and adopted the British Westminster system of government at its independence in 1962. And Rodney would be expelled from the country in 1968, sparking protests by university students and faculty and the wider community. And a big part of the fear of Rodney was that he was attempting to align with the Rastafari movement, notably Fisher and Henry's organization, to transform Jamaica into not a socialist, but a Marxist state. By that time, Fisher's organization was renamed the New Creation International Peacemakers Association. And that name change came after the 1960 conviction of Fisher and Henry and other members of the organization on treason felony charges. And it was 100 years since they had used that charge, and nobody in Jamaica has been charged with treason felony since then. The police came with warrants authorizing them to search the premises at Rosalie Avenue, Fisher's premises, and they started the search in Fisher's bedroom because they knew that she was one of the two leaders of the organization. And in her bedroom, they found various contraband, including knives, machetes, batons, ammunition, detonators, and dynamite. I'm not going to get into whether they were actually guilty of planning a coup, because that's a different conversation. But I will say this, that even more detrimental to Fisher was the police's discovery of a letter to Fidel Castro asking for his help to topple the government of Jamaica. 12 persons signed that letter, including Fisher, who also wrote that she was the brigadier of the movement. Henry himself did not sign the letter, which the court retained. The government, after the trial, sentenced Henry to 10 years and Fisher to 3. Again, we see the patriarchal nature of the colonial suppression here in the sentencing. Colonial officials and Fisher herself made it very clear during the trial that she was central to the creation and leadership of the church. It was her land on which they built the church. It was through her business contacts that they got more funding for it. And she gave a lot more of her cash than Henry gave to build the church. But Henry himself also tried to protect Fisher by making it seem like he was the one responsible for everything during the trial. And the government believed him, or he said exactly what they needed to hear. After Fisher's release from prison in 1963, she revived the organization at Kemps Hill in the parish of Clarendon. She ran it without Henry until his early release on good behavior in 1966. That's 3 years. They were married in 1967 and continued to run the organization together until Fisher's tragic death in 1970. In 1968, they purchased land at Greenbottom in Clarendon, claiming 4,000 members. And they also built a compound known as Bethel on that land, which was both a Black religious and entrepreneurial community. It had a church, a school, a bakery, a block-making factory, a farm, and several homes. Nevertheless, Fisher's role in establishing the peacemakers and Bethel, as it was in the case of the ARC, was obscured by the government's attention on Henry's activities. In his memoirs, Rodney recalled that while at Kemps Hill, the peacemakers had gathered together several Black brothers and sisters and had turned themselves into an independent Black economic community. Rodney, however, did not know that Fisher was the one who had organized the community. He also did not realize that Henry went there 3 years after its establishment. Nevertheless, Rodney recalls seeing a fish business operated by the peacemakers from the outset or while at Kemps Hill, and later they added a bakery which Fisher also established. She also established a school, an African school known as Crofts School initially, to provide the children with the empowering African education that she had envisioned in the 50s. And they then renamed it Ethiopian.
A couple of minutes more, maybe 1 or 2 minutes. If
yes,
you don't mind.
yes.
Thank you to wrap up.
Yes, wonderful. I'm getting there. So, and they renamed the school the Ethiopian Peacemaker School. When the community essentially considered Fisher as the mother and protector and guide of the community. And it shocked them in 1970 when she was murdered, but they did not, this is what one of the persons who, one of the members had to say, Jonathan Reed. And it says a lot about why Fisher was murdered. He said, "I'm not a fool. I was there when Sister Edna died. It was widely stated and agreed that it was Miss Edna who was primarily responsible for the upkeep of Reverend, that's Henry, and the organization. Therefore, removing Sister Edna out of the way would sink the ship." And after she was murdered, the community, it went down, it started to decline. And today it still exists, but it's nothing like it used to be. It's very small and very few members. So to kind of summarize what all of this implies, I think, is that despite the marginalization of Fisher and the reports on her organization, she and many other women helped to transform the political and social development of the Black freedom struggle in Jamaica through the organization and direction of their church to spread Black nationalism. And their activism was instrumental in actually transforming the way the Jamaican government after independence approached the Rastafari. It was no longer just with animosity, but there was a good deal of attempt to also appease, to reach out to the movement. The Jamaican government even signed on to send in exploratory missions to Africa to look into the prospect of repatriation. So I think we can end there, and I look forward to your questions. Thank you for listening.
Thank you very much, Dave. Thank you. And I just remind everybody that technically we'll take all the Q&A at the end, so that we'll not record that side. But anyway, I just wanted to jump and say thank you very much to give us such a complex kind of landscape of sovereignty, double messianism, the limits of the desire of patriarchy. You really sort of intersected a lot of very important themes. So, and I'll go straight away again to our third presenter today, who is Dr. Alejandro Escalante. who is a lecturer in social anthropology at King's College London. He receives his PhD from the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill. And Alejandro's research combines Caribbean theory and philosophy, gender and sexuality studies, and cultural anthropology to think about the ways we make ourselves human through costuming, makeup, and performance. His current research project traces the relationship between revolutionary politics and religion in the Black Atlantic and examine how political revolutionaries in the Caribbean drew inspiration from religion. Thank you very much. And Alejandro, the floor is yours.
Hi, thank you very much. So I'd just like to say that some of my contact information is just on the screen here. If you'd like to send an email if we don't get to it in the Q&A, and also a website where you can find the slides and the references for what I'll be talking about today. So I'll leave that up here for just a moment. Hola, she said flirtatiously. And before I could respond, she had opened the small gate to the entrance to the yard and made her way up the driveway of the rented accommodation. Over her right shoulder, she carried a flimsy tree branch, and her left was a large aluminum can, which was empty, save for a few coins at the bottom. As she made her way up the drive, she passed the tree branch and broom in front of her feet and hummed a song to herself. She must be crazy, I thought to myself. Her hair was wrapped in a handkerchief tied at the front. She was wearing slippers and a nightgown. Who is this strange woman? Indeed, she was no ordinary woman. She was an extraordinary woman. She was beyond ordinary, that is. She was excessive, unruly, uncivilized. She was La Loca, a persona that Loiseños take on during the celebration of La Fiesta de Santiago, what I'm going to be calling La Fiesta. She's played by men who cross-dress, who stuff their shirts and trousers to give the impression of large breasts and buttocks. The men who played her would be racialized as Black, and yet they doubled down on their Blackness by painting their faces blacker with makeup, emphasizing their lips with brightly colored lipstick. She was out of place in so many ways: her labor, her outfit, and her makeup. And aside from the unrequested work of sweeping people's porches and driveways, she went around La Fiesta drinking uninhibitedly, flirting with men, dancing suggestively. Locas come to have a good time, a research participant once told me. This paper is based on my ethnographic fieldwork in Loíza, Puerto Rico, and the Jamaican poet and essayist Sylvia Wynter's theorization of the demonic. Barring the term from physics, the demonic is a set of data whose outcome is unknown. Said differently, it is a horizon whose coordinates cannot be yet established because the current tools of analysis are insufficient. Therefore, it remains open-ended, able to go in any direction, indeed, seemingly multiple directions all at once. Applying Wynter to La Loca, I seek to uncover the demonic, open-ended, and unknown futurity of Puerto Rico's colonial life via her misfitting. So to give a sense of where we're going, following this introduction, I'll give a brief history of the festival to help locate La Loca within it. After this history, I'll more fully develop Wynter's demonic, emphasizing her theorization as a decolonial method and theory. In the penultimate section of this paper, I'll connect Wynter's demonic with La Loca via my connections with her performers in Loíza. I argue that in La Loca, we have an example of a decolonial approach to futurity. As the demonic resists finality, this decolonial approach does not suggest a specific end. Indeed, La Loca's madness offers a critique of method. Her decolonial approach to religious life is about playful excessiveness and wasteful expenditure. She does not calculate cost or outcomes. She's there to have a good time. Each July, the celebrations held in honor of St. James, Santiago, are celebrated in Loíza, Puerto Rico, a coastal city in the northeastern part of the island. During the festivities, images of Santiago are processed through the streets. As the procession moves along the main thoroughfare of Loíza, The processional crowd grows larger and larger and more raucous. As part of the procession, people drink, dance, and costume as one of several festival characters. La Laiqah is one of those festival characters. And here, just in the background, maybe just a note, maybe not in the background, toward the forefront, if you can see that electrical pole there, you have some of the festival characters that are more dominant. El Vigilante on the right and El Caballero on the, El Vigilante on the left and El Caballero on the right, two of the main kind of festival characters who go along with La Laiqah. La Fiesta is one of the many patron saint festivals in Puerto Rico. Luiseños trace its inspiration back to a legendary 9th century battle between Catholics and Moors in southern Spain. According to legend, Santiago promised the Catholic King Ramiro I victory in a decisive battle. While there's no historical data for the battle or the vision outside of the legend itself, the power of the story influenced legal, ethnic, and religious life in Spain, even to this day. And eventually a feast was established to honor Santiago, July 25th. During the later medieval celebrations, there would be dramatic reenactments of a battle between Catholics and Moors, with costuming and masking as Santiago and his representatives and as Moors. As Spanish Catholics made their ways to the Americas, they brought Santiago with them, and with them, that legend. Over the years, new festival characters were added to the repertoire of personages associated with La Fiesta, and to the two traditional characters who represent Catholics and Moors were added a host of others, including La Laiqah. La Laiqah is a raucous character who is known for her mischievous and transgressive behavior. She is often found in the company of her girlfriends, who are other locas, and together they twerk provocatively on the top of cars, they flirt with procession goers, and drink uninhibitedly on the street. In general, they upset boundaries of proper behavior, which are meant to guide and uphold what it means to be a citizen. For Sylvia Wynter, these guidelines influence what it is to be considered human. And for her, human is overdetermined by this category of man with a capital M. Through two moments, one theological and the other secular, man has been established as the natural order, she says. In the first, man is established in relationship to his heathen other through the Columbian encounter in the Americas. In the second, the Darwinian evolution helps to establish man as the natural subject of the world. In either case, however, Wynter argues that man finds himself in a dialectical relationship with his others. In his others, he finds blackness, darkness, blindness, penetrability, impregnability, and dependence. As such, man casts himself against his racial, sexual, and disabled others. Leonardo da Vinci's Vitruvian Man, she says, is one of the perfect representations of man. Humans appearing as other are deviations from this one true essence, man, making him the immutable point of departure for everything else. Difference is understood as distortion of this original source, and this original source commands proper adherence to strict codes of productivity, and here that should be read as sexual productivity and economic productivity. Wynter wants to move beyond this notion of human as man, and to do so, she builds off so-called demonic models from physics, which theorize a subject position that is, quote, outside the space-time orientation of the homuncular observer. Wynter draws her inspiration for thinking about these demonic perspectives from her reading of The Tempest, William Shakespeare's 17th century play about Prospero and his daughter Miranda, who are stranded on an island and encounter creatures they deem to be subhuman. As the drama unfolds, Prospero enslaves a purportedly monstrous Caliban. And in her reading, Prospero is man, capital M. He is powerful, agential, and productive. He acts and wills in order to create the world that he desires without regard for the lives of others. On the other hand, everyone else, including Miranda, Prospero's own daughter, is a deviation from this primordial essence. Caliban's enslavement requires no justification, as he is not quite human. However, in a half-hearted exchange for his servitude, Prospero gifts the half-human, half-monster Caliban with language. And Winter argues that that like Caliban, Caribbean people have been given the tools for being read as human, yet they retain their status as less than in relation to the Prosperos of the world. Demonic models, she says, sidestep this issue by offering a theoretical position that is not beholden to man/Prospero. However, her argument is not for another word or system, because anything that's produced within this age, the age of human as man, will fall into the present problem of overdetermination. Caliban, speak as he may, will never be considered human. For while language is a marker of humanity, it is insufficient for the task. Further, his speaking is already captured by what Prospero/man has already determined that fits his capital H schema. Therefore, Winter argues it is not enough to conceive of another model, which would inevitably fall into the same problem. Caliban is always less than, even if he speaks. Therefore, as decolonial scholar Walter Mignolo notes, she is not looking to change or supersede epistemic categories and established knowledge, but rather seeks to undo the systems through which knowledge and knowing are constituted. La Laiqah, I propose, is one method by which man's systems of gender, race, and religion might be undone. In Puerto Rico, La Laiqah literally means a crazy woman. It is mainly used pejoratively to describe one's mental health. It is used in another sense, though, to refer to men who are typically assumed to desire other men. Here we should notice the grammatical ending, Laiqah, to describe men. There is a slippage here in the sense that one's sexuality is being used to describe one's gender. So therefore, there's a linking between this prescribed gender roles and prescribed sexuality roles. Laiqah then is a way of collapsing these three areas into one, of gender, sexuality, and mental health. The result being that one is crazy because they, in this particular case, are men who desire other men. Laiqahs are mad because they do not fit into properly idealized categories of what it means to be human, that is, fit into these prescribed categories. Melissa Gonzalez further notes that La Laiqah reflects parallels in the biopolitical management of both craziness and homosexuality, two subjectivities that have been historically relegated to a position of otherness. Willian is a Laiqah, proudly. For years now, he told me that he's performed La Laiqah during La Fiesta. A mí me gusta joder. He casually offered to no one in particular when we met outside our church in Louisa. With a mouthful of food, he let out a deep chuckle. He said, almost dismissing himself and what he had just said. Joder has a range of usages in Puerto Rico. According to the RAE, the self-appointed body whose mission it is to stabilize and prescribe Spanish use, joder means to fuck, as in engage in sexual intercourse. In Puerto Rico, joder is a bit more flexible. It can be used to talk about sexual copulation, but it can also be used to talk about frustration. If your car suddenly starts acting up, you might mutter joder under your breath between pleas for otherworldly intervention. But it can also be used to describe something that fails to meet standards. A parent, for example, might use it to describe simple mischievous behavior. In this case, no jodas is a command to stop messing around. In other situations, the very same phrase, said with more gusto and a puffed up chest, can mean stop fucking around. Willian's use walked the line between these two, between mischievous behavior and fucking around, each playfully suggesting the other, feeding the other, and playing off the other. La Laiqah plays by fucking around and fucks around by playing. In one conversation that I had with Willian, I asked him about how he prepares his outfits for his transformation into La Laiqah. At the top of his list were his bata, his nightgown, and his handkerchief combinations, which he liked to call exotic animal prints. He told me he didn't need to stuff his trousers to create a faux buttock, Porque ya tengo nalgas suficientes, he said. He said with a wry smile as he smacked his hip and blew a kiss. He doesn't need to stuff his trousers because he already has a large enough ass. He doubled over laughing after provocatively offering me his behind. He was testing boundaries and crossing others. He did not shy away from accusations of impropriety. Instead, he raucously accepted allegations of locura with a suggestive wink and a slap of his bottom. I asked him why he liked to mess around, and he looked at me confused. I just like to have fun, he said, again repeating joder. With the shrug of his shoulders and the puzzled look on his face suggested that he had never been asked this kind of question before. Thinking about this question now, why do you like to have fun, seems strange, even to me. Is he asking me why I like to have fun? He must have thought to himself. Ever since I was a kid, I like to have fun, he continued, pausing momentarily only to wink. In school, the teachers used to tell my parents that I couldn't sit still. I was always getting into trouble doing little things, getting into trouble at school. He looked up as if seeing the memory in the sky, and he laughed to himself again. I guess dressing up is no different, he surmised, shrugging slightly. As La Loca, he finds a space for transgression.
Alejandro, another 1 or 2 minutes, if you don't mind. Thank you.
Yeah, okay. So I'll skip a little bit here. So Willian does not have time to play now. Willian does not plan for much except for having a good time. However, there are limits to this. As an adult with taxes to pay and rent, he says, you have to grow up between bites of food. You can't be a kid forever, you know? Clicked his teeth and finished the last spoonfuls of food on his plate and sauntered off to get another beer. So this paper has traced the ways that La Loca, the festival character from Luisa, who entices and vexes the festival goers at La Fiesta, is a method of decolonial critique. As critic, though, she does not offer finality. Indeed, implicit in Winter's demonic models is what Georges Bataille calls the poetic fallacy. The fallacy of trying to think of what it might be to be more than human falls into the predicament of humanity. We can only think of it in human terms. We are limited in our imaginative possibilities. And like Willian, we realize we cannot be children forever. And we run up against the realities of death, taxes, and rent. La Loca is thus another synonym. La Loca, thus, is not a synonym for demonic models, but instead a way that we might look to affect the resulting non-homuncular point of view through her remixing of supposedly calcified understandings of gender, race, and religion, through her indecent acts of gender bending in the middle of a Catholic feast. She upsets the solid foundation of man. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Alejandro. I see quite a few kind of comments on the side, and I'm just double checking with the organizer that they are saving the text. Are you saving so that you can pass it on? Then, we'll try to discuss absolutely, but in case we can't, so at least there's a text that can be passed on to the presenter. And for the sake of time, thank you very much on kind of this Laiqah was very sort of interesting way to, again, going about central tenets of Christianity and the Americas, by the way, which is the man, the man and the universal man. We know it's a very important inception. I'll go straight to the work of, to present our last presenter, Dr. Fernando Gomez Herrero, who is a lecturer at the Center for Transnational Intercultural Study at the School of Arts, Languages and Culture at the University of Manchester. He's interested in the historical interaction between the Americas and Europe, with a focus on the Hispanic world expansively understood, legacy of the early modern colonial period, 1500, 1800, and colonial studies and post-colonial theories. And his presentation is on Eric Dussell's political theology. So the floor is yours, Fernando.
Enrique Dussel, in conversation with me in an interview, wanted to distinguish theology of liberation and philosophy of liberation very clearly, because otherwise he found the juxtaposition or the mixture disastrous. And appealing to Latin American experiences, he also fought against the understanding of modernity as secularization. So I want to bring your attention to the following aspects. On the one hand, the segregation policy of these two disciplines. Also, in his case, there's no rejection of theology per se, but a discrete disavowal, keeping God, as it were, under wraps. There's also the sameness and difference distinction between Latin American experiences and others. Latin America remains for Dussel the irrenounceable chronotope, frame 1492 to the future, the Latin bit as opposed to Anglo, and the horizon of liberation today, but taking into account the heyday in the 60s. Obviously, we have to remember Weber's modernity as secularization processes or disenchantment, the isolation of self-sufficient reason, or going at it alone. Yet we have the desire to retrieve something of this deep time of ancient religions. Today, this is coming from another book from Dussel that you can see at the top. Today, at the beginning of the 21st century, it's necessary to return to the origin and rediscover the cultural importance of the symbolic narrative of the texts called sacred as a crucial theme of a critical hermeneutics that is strictly philosophical, task which Levinas help us to realize or accomplish in relation to the Semitic tradition, which was impossible for Spinoza, but without fully understanding about Levinas, how he remained imprisoned by a certain political philosophy inside a horizon of Zionism, or narrow, as he calls it, Davidian messianism. And in this quote, Dussel goes to his favorite house, the philosophical house, and includes the selective philosophical club of Michel Henry, Habermas, Badiou, Zizek, Hinkelhammer, Vatimo, etc. Another quote, Spinoza exemplifies for him the secularizing beginning of modernity, which in this quoted book, what he wants to do, what Dussel wants to do is to retrace the historical steps to what he calls the first Hispanic modernity and deconstruct such secularizing process, and at least complicate it, not to take it for granted in what he proposes to be a global or expansive, or what he calls critical world history. So Dussel wants to complicate such Weberian trajectory. Do we want to separate religion and reason or not? Do we look at the past for the possible futures or not? Do we mix the various disciplines, history, politics, theology, ethics or not? Do we maintain Anglo models of area studies or take these studies to a larger frame of convergence or intelligibility, i.e. world? These are big questions. Dussel is undoubtedly one of the most important intellectual figures coming out of Latin America since the 60s. He's a fundamental thinker of extraordinary vision, stamina, courage, impetus, and generosity. His is a tremendous production that will keep you busy many evenings. He continues to be inspiring since the said interview with me. What follows is a fast critique or interrogation of some tensions or irresolutions. In other words, it's not either or, but we need to think both. We need to think mixtures. We need to think combinations. And I here take into account his big, bewildering historical liberationist horizons and the 20th limit thesis, schema or stigmata of his futurist politics. So I focus on 20 theses on politics. It's the political that summons me, and it is, I dare say, the failure of the brief book that motivates me. The contrast with the colossal historical Historia Mundial y Crítica is sharp. It's as though the too big of the historical work cannot go together with the too small of the former booklet, written at about the same time, 2006, 2007. There is simply too much history and too much world to be put in the 20 theses. 20 Theses is a tribute to Walter Benjamin. Whilst there are 1001 references to other authors, there's an unmistakable predilection for a dialogue with the Germano-French core European philosophy that remains true to this day as it was decades ago. The true core of the favorite club, we may want to call it, of Dussell's collection of interlocutor. This is Dussell's Will Society of Interlocutors, birds of a feather. The hegemonic Anglo world remains marginal, also philosophically, in the rear window, so to speak. I'm not going to read the extensive quotes in relation to Carl Schmitt. Obviously, political theology refers to the German thinker. And 20 Theses include 3 specific references to Carl Schmitt in relation to the notion of enemy, private, public, and total. And in relation to the enemy friend, obviously what Dussell is trying to do, side with Derrida against Schmitt, and perhaps trying to also undermine the universal fraternity of Kant and what he calls Schmitt's Eurocentric nationalism. He uses that specific term. So there are many references to Schmitt in the big critical world history, which, by the way, Schmitt uses the terminology of political theology already in 1934. So we can think of Dussell turning around or turning upside down Schmitt, where Schmitt is right, Dussell would be left. Where Schmitt is a strictly European German core within the time frame of the Weimar Republic and post-World War II, Dussell would be peripheral Latin American perspectivism since the 60s. Where Schmitt is situationist, Machiavellian in his political understanding of how to intervene in society, Dussell is more of a foundationalist thinker in the Roman Catholic tradition of differentialist Latin American liberation philosophy, side by side liberation theology, where Schmitt tries to digest, I like using that terminology, tries to comprehend the collapse of the grand supremacist European civilization in his great book, and tremendously intellectually challenging Nomos of the Earth. Dussell would simplify, would mean the unremitting desire for an independent Latin American self-identity construction since the 60s versus European legacies and US impositions, where Schmitt is obviously problematically Nazi sympathizer, conservative or reactionary, let's say, individual, and interestingly close to Franco Spain at the end of his life. Dussell would be, interestingly, also almost contemporaneously pursuing doctoral studies in Madrid and La Sorbonne, pursuing some experiences in Israel at that time. And he's an example of a long-standing exile from Argentina due to the military dictatorship, settlement in Mexico, and frequent contacts and visits to the US, at least since the 90s. And that's where I met him in the late 90s at Duke University. And Walter Mignolo is also the mediator presence there. 2 Schmittian elements that Dussell wants to rescue. One, the opening up of reason to the notion of narrative, and obviously the dialogue with Logos as narrative, but also the ritual, the ritualistic, particularly in connection with ancestral cultures, what Rico calls ethical mythical nucleus. Also, what Dussell wants to do, not only looking at Schmitt, because there are many other authors he points out, Hinkelhammer, is a critique of teleology. The notion of teleology, which we could translate as futurity, is not to be thrown out the window for a more immanentist approach to social energies. And both authors, coming from different political sides of the spectrum and different milieus, looking critically at liberalism's fetishisms. One, Schmidt is trying to vindicate the notion of state of exception for his politics. Interventionist in the moment of the Weimar Republic earlier in his life, and Dussel will try to do something else, which I will mention presently. I don't have time, obviously, to develop a tremendously rich thinking, but let me just say that Dussel performs a kind of a left critique of the Carl Schmittian critique of Western liberalism, most importantly also of the standard secularization of modernity. Dussel's Latin American Roman Catholicism, we may want to call it non-establishment or non-mainstream variety, embraces the notion of political theology. There's a construction of an ontology as well that is future-oriented, and future-oriented not being but becoming, that cannot and does not want to break the relationship with the sign God, theology. Hence, no modernity of this relationship, according to Weber, but a transmodernity of a relationship with other non-conventional or non-institutional means of making sense of the world, narrative or discourse or logos or quote-unquote philosophy. Obviously, also what Dussel is trying to do is try to open up to continentalities of neglect that must be rescued and put on the table of discussion. Dussel represents a civilizational critique of Benjaminian inspiration, bringing all of this home to the immediate setting. Now, I repeat, I'm not going to say right or wrong. I'm trying to think with Dussel some of these fundamental challenges. One, can we go beyond the us versus them of politics? Dussel wants to transcend that. Is that even possible? Does he achieve that? Dussel clings to the notion of teleology. Is it possible so the transcendental trumps the imminent, so to speak, and the teleological or the transcendental appears impossible to disentangle from the theological dimension. And this is not necessarily a bad thing. So in other words, the notion of reason going, self-sufficient reason going at things alone cannot be maintained, even though Dussel continues using the specific terminal, the adverbial precision of strictly philosophical, obviously because he's committed to a certain particularly continental European tradition of philosophy with which he wants to dialogue from we can call the colonial Latin American difference even today. He maintains, he will defend his territory, which I call chronotope, it can be a time space, the wholesale unit of Latin America in total for Dussel. Dussel upsets Schmidt's thought, Hobbes' sovereignty, state of exception, Machiavellian instrumentalism. Schmidt, in a sense, is the perfect intellectual enemy for Dussel. And what he does, what the Argentinian thinker does, is to seek foundations and his own ontologies, finding inspiration in Roman Catholicism of Latin American experiences in relation to the peoples, el pueblo, the majoritarian or populist experience of exclusion. Just one example, against Hobbes, he will put the Spanish Jesuit scholastic Suarez to try to conceive, to try to construct, to try to recreate a first modernity understanding of politics that is different from Hobbesian, which is the mainstream in the Anglo. You only have to look at Eikenberry, for example, the liberal international order. What is underneath that is a Hobbesian conception of politics since the 17th century.
Fernando, just 1 minute or two, because we are
1 minute or two.
Yeah,
let me
sorry, we have already over the 15 minutes. Yeah.
Yes. Let me just then finish with this slide. I'll be happy to make my slides available to those who might be interested. Let me just then do the following. Dussel's philosophy, which is also an ethics, does not and cannot jettison theo. the logos of God, particularly in relation to the monotheism embedded in the Judeo-Christian tradition. The impact of Levinas, the use of biblical scripture, and the strategic use of religious thinkers make that very clear. And a few Latin American theologians and thinkers, Hinckelhammer, for example, also included in his narrative. God, the sign God, may be another sign for nomos, order, cosmos, one big impossible expansive totality, the beyond, the excess, the plus ultra reason, the gravitational pull of the ethical, etc. God may be summoned by the deep unconscious state of ancient rituals, the myths and narratives and collective practices, the ideal, perhaps the ideal anchor of morality, but also a few good venerable books, great authors and impressive thinkers, a series of images, the literatures, languages and cultures, etc., with elements of iconoclasm, tensions, and war. Let me just finish with the following. What would, with those 3 sentences, what would the elimination of God mean? Its death. Would it mean an anti-historicism? Would it mean a total secularism of superficial subjects with no feeling for all languages or blind to ancient images? Is theology deep? Is politics? Thank you. I'll stop there.